Okay, hello everyone and good morning and welcome to this webinar in collaboration with EY on the topic of incentivizing and rewarding your team. This is of course a very important topic for all businesses of all sizes, whether you're just starting out, growing or established, as obviously people are a key component of reaching your business goals and objectives, and keeping them happy along the way is important for continuing that. So our speaker today is Richard Caulfield, who is Associate Partner at EY and part of the People Advisory Services. Richard is going to cover related strategies and considerations for incentivizing teams as a company grows. So the format, so Richard is going to kick off with a presentation, and then we'll hand the floor over to Q&A. So you can use the chat box to submit your questions whilst Richard is speaking, or at the end, when we open up the floor, you can just pop your hand up, raise your hand if it's easier to do so, and you can do that using the functions at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So we are recording, as you've heard, so you'll get a copy of the recording post-session, so you can catch up on the content then. Yes, with that, I hope you enjoy the session. And Richard, I'm now going to hand the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to say, since I submitted my bio a couple of weeks ago, I've actually been promoted. So I'm a partner rather than associate partner now. It's the first time I've got to introduce myself as that on the call, so that's nice. So Richard Caulfield, I'm split my time between offices across our south. So today I'm in London, but spend a fair amount of time across Reading, Bristol, Cambridge, bit of everything really. And the team that I sit in is our reward team. So this is what we advise on day in, day out. A whole mixture of companies, right from the top of the FTSE to smaller founder managed businesses. So I'm going to try to talk fairly broadly across the piece here, but with more of an emphasis on private businesses who are gearing up for growth, essentially. But I'll try and touch on different areas and different examples that we've seen from across different sectors and businesses at different points in their life cycle. So incentivizing and rewarding your people. This is what we're going to be talking through. So first of all, a life cycle. So how business size will impact the type of package that you offer. I'm also going to touch on sector a little bit there. The challenge is that people see developing a reward strategy, something on the use of equity incentives or share plans if you prefer. Then we're going to touch on design principles. So essentially a way to keep yourself focused on, is the design that I've come up with for my total reward package actually reflective of what I wanted to do when I started out and where we want to take this business in the longer term. And finally, what we often see as problems that companies run into and some suggested solutions to work through those. So, reward maturity curve. So when it comes to setting reward packages, we see a couple of key drivers of the types of package that companies put together. One is sector, and I'll touch on that a little in a moment. But first of all, this graph here, which is really about business size and how long a business has been around for and how that impacts things. So if we look at the earlier stage businesses over on the left, essentially a lot of the reward package tends to be about hope value. So we tend to see lower fixed pay. We don't see big HR functions rolling out benefits packages and those types of things. Rather, it's about getting people to buy in to the longer term journey that the company's on and a belief in the longer term value and how they can participate in that. And that often leads to either giving employees shares, so ordinary shares we put here. Easiest way to get someone to participate in the growth and value of a company is quite simply to make them a shareholder. And then we often see options, particularly EMI options. I'll touch on those in more detail later, but essentially a tax efficient way of offering someone some shares, not today, but in the future, usually dependent on some kinds of goals, both in terms of staying in employment and the growth of the business as well. So smaller businesses, hope value being that key driver. And then businesses stay around for a little while. They start to go through investment rounds. They start to scale up. And your basic pay package, so salary essentially, tends to be more aligned to the market. It's less about that real big uptick in growth. And it tends to instead be about exit planning as being a big part of it. So companies who either would like to be acquired or think they will IPO at some point in the future. So really understanding how exiting the business and growing value towards that exit ties into your reward package. And key part of that, we've got the third one down there, is growth shares, which again, I'll go into a little more detail later on, but essentially have a lot of the same features as an EMI plan in terms of it's about growth. It's not giving someone a share in what the business is worth today, but rather what the business is going to grow to in the future, and ideally finding some tax incentives that sit around that. And we also start to see companies, as they grow, start to look at global packages. So this is a common area of challenge, which I'll touch on in the last slide, which I covered today, in terms of, okay, we kind of just got our head around what happens in the UK. Now we're wanting to develop abroad, employ people abroad, grow the business itself abroad. Can we do the same things overseas as we can in the UK? And I think when we look at that, we tend to reach the conclusion that in most large economies, there's an overriding principle in pay, which is, and certainly the tax on pay, which is generally people are taxable on the difference between what something is worth and what they pay for it. And they're taxable at the point at which they get that. But there are enough nuances globally that any cash or shares package should be looked at before you start to roll it out and put anything else in abroad. Yeah. And the final one that we've got there is pre and post IPO. So this is about aligning to a post IPO market. So most of the thinking that goes on around incentive plans as a company's in, say, the last 2 years, but particularly the last 6 months, pre-IPO or other exit event, is how do we actually realize some of the value from these plans? We don't want to put something in that's not quite clear where the money will end up coming from. So it tends to be around winding up those old incentive packages that you had and putting in new ones post-IPO, which are much more aligned to market practice and for what's required of a listed business, and all of the formal governance that needs to start to sit around that. And as that happens on IPO, we tend to see some of those conditions around people's pay package be less about aggressive growth and more about longevity with the company. So the last thing we want to do when we've IPO'd or we just exited the business in some way is that you lose all the people that gave that business value. So it tends to, you go through a period where you want to tie people into the business rather than necessarily just be making this about growth and future exit events. So that's what it is in terms of business cycle. I did say I would mention sector because that does sit across this as well. So we certainly do see some clear trends on what, depending on what sector you're looking at. Certainly my time in practice, which is 17 years now, the first time I saw this really come through was, it was all of the tech stuff from the US. So in the UK, we'd always had this quite settled system of offer someone some shares in 3 years if they're still sticking around. And I think tech from the US was the first sector that got comfortable with, maybe our employees don't want to be here in 3 years and maybe we're okay with that. So kind of we see things as regular as monthly vesting rather than having to wait for a long period of time. There are different trends across different sectors I'd be happy to touch on, but generally if you want someone's sector specific skills and you're out there recruiting for them, you'll get to know the sector trends pretty quickly because they'll be offered those things already. So it's about being competitive with what's being offered there. Feel free, by the way, anyone to to raise a hand, jump in with any questions, and I will open the floor for questions at the end, but I'm very happy to take them as I go along as well. So key goals of a reward strategy. There's a couple of parts to this. The first part, those bullets at the top, I'll cut across them all by essentially saying, what do you need people to do to create business success, and make sure you reward that? What we see far too often is companies who put a reward package in, they put it in 5 or 10 years ago, they're still doing the same thing. And then when we come to look at how they can reinvent their reward package, there's just no real alignment between what they're trying to do as a business and what their people are actually being rewarded to do day to day. So thinking about those key skills that you need, what do you need to do, for example, to get to an exit, if that is what you're trying to do? What do you need to incentivize to inspire growth or longevity of employment? Really thinking about what you want your people to be doing, and so you can align them to that. And the second part here is making sure that all of your spend has a purpose. A reward is, for many businesses, the single biggest cost that you have. And much as it's very nice to feel that you've ticked every box of a reward package, and I put some of them down here, salary, bonus, benefits packages, LTIs, are your employees actually feeling the value of that? And really challenging yourself, I would say on an annual basis, about that as a business. I think too often we will have clients come to us and say, this bonus plan, or quite often we hear it from the employees rather than the business. I don't really understand what all of that's about. And quite often the reflex as a business, I think, is to say, okay, how can we get better at communicating and explaining this? I say that's one thing, but also be willing to cut these types of things. I had a conversation about 3 months ago with someone. The best paid person in the business outside of the founder, as the business was about to IPO, and he said, oh yeah, it's nice to speak to a third party, because I'm a bit embarrassed to say it, but I don't really understand what this share package is about. And it was the single most valuable thing they were getting, and the company were spending 7-figure amount on this person's share remuneration. And essentially, I wouldn't say they needn't have bothered, because people want to see shares sometimes as part of a senior reward package, but they obviously weren't driving his behaviors. And really, that's what reward should be about. It should be about driving behaviors to get a business outcome. And if your employees don't understand what it is, communicating it is one thing, but also be willing to flex completely and say, you know what, an LTI isn't the right answer for us here. Shares aren't the right answer for us here. A benefits package isn't the right answer. And really getting a best fit for what you're trying to do as a business. Implementing a reward strategy. So this is a diagram that essentially sets that out, but adds a couple of things on the end. So certainly, I think that communication piece is so key. So I think as reward professionals, we sometimes have a slight reflex that because we're so down in the detail, and we spend ages working with clients on exactly what the right package for them is, there's kind of a level of assumed knowledge that we take into it when we take it out to the rest of the company. And it was brought home to me when I did an employee comms session not all that long ago for a fairly wide section of the employees, and co-hosted it with the company, and it went well, it got good feedback, but at the same time, there was an opportunity to ask questions later on, and one of them was quite simply, what's a share? And we'd done that classic thing of just jumping in a little bit further along the line, because we'd sort of got absorbed in what the share plan was and all of the facets and all of the performance conditions, just really understand that people might not understand what they're getting outside of salary, which I think it's fair to assume everyone implicitly gets, because that's the way that we're used to everyone getting paid. Even an annual bonus, communicate, really make people understand when they're getting value, how that's going to be communicated, what they can do to increase the value that they're getting through it to really drive those behaviors. And the last one there is review it. So is it relevant? Is it current? Is it effective? And involve your employees in that conversation. I don't think there's any point people sitting around in a boardroom saying, oh yeah, I think that works. I understand how all that works. Go out to your employees, do employee surveys, check that they really understand what each part of the benefits package is. Even if you put a lot of money into putting in a cycle to work scheme, if no one's taking it up, or very few people are, be willing to knock it on the head and move on and take that as feedback. So you end up with a nice reward cycle here where you essentially do, as I say, I generally advise an annual review of what's going on, and then go straight back to the beginning. Okay, and now what are the business's strategic objectives today, and how can our reward package drive that? Total reward here. So don't forget the intangibles when it comes to reward. We rightly spend a lot of time thinking about salary and about thinking about an annual bonus and about thinking about long-term incentives, if that's the right answer for the business. But research has shown that really that is perhaps only half of the picture. And this certainly reflects my personal journey. I've left 3 jobs in the past, and I think all of them, my manager at the time would say, okay, he left for a pay rise. I think in all of them, I did end up getting a pay rise, but really, I started looking for another job because of these intangibles on screen now, because the work wasn't flexible enough, because I didn't feel stretched, because I wasn't being trained, because I didn't understand my career path, because there wasn't that kind of informal recognition as you go along. So just never losing sight of the fact that that big other part that's so hard to put benchmarks around is actually a hard thing perhaps to use to sort of communicate to the market, but really important to people you have at the moment, and perhaps the biggest retention tool that you have for your people at the moment. So we've got here, yeah, flexible benefits obviously is a big one for people, but that freedom and autonomy thing, I think particularly in today's market, is just so important. People really understanding about, okay, how much can I flex my job to fit around the parts of my career, the parts of my life that aren't to do with my career. And really, again, that communication piece, remind your employees how good your package is in these ways. So if you have, for example, a great flexible work policy, remind your employees about that. You know, I think companies are pretty good now at getting towards doing annual reward statements that don't just say your salary is X, but rather remind people about their bonuses and other parts of pay. Just reminding people about, you know, what some of the broader stuff of what it's like to work for the company and what else you have to bring to a person's career. Really important. So what we have here, if you're not thinking about all employee reward at the moment, but rather are thinking about some of the most senior people in an organization, I just thought it would be interesting and hopefully useful to just dive into what that tends to look like for a private company which is in growth mode. So how do we tend to see the most senior people in those organizations fairly early in their life cycle being rewarded as part of their pay package? So incentive delivered through a one-off. I think this is important. It's something that's very different at different parts of the life cycle. We don't tend to see in scale-up organizations annual grants, for example, of shares or other long-term incentives. Rather, it's when you join, okay, and here's a load of shares, or here's a promise to deliver cash in the future, or some other reward that incentivizes you to stay in the business for the long term. Unlike some of the post-IPO stuff where there might be an annual or biannual grant cycle that we see. Equity tends to be targeted to this senior management level. Yeah, I think there doesn't tend to be so much depth in where long-term incentives are offered to within smaller organizations. We don't tend to see all employee share plans, for example, but we very much do see all of the senior people who can actually change the value of that business being given some sort of equity-based incentive, because it's such a neat way to tie you into long-term shareholder value. Tax efficiency preferred. I think that is a key word. Don't let tax be the driver of what you do. But if there is one of the tax efficient ways of remunerating people in the UK, which happens to also tie into what you're trying to achieve as a business, absolutely be willing to go that extra mile and see whether one of those plans fits for you, because it incentivizes your employees more if they know they're going to be paying less tax at the back end. Long-term incentive being reliant on an exit, this is pretty common. So when a company is scaling up, yes, it might not have an exit date in mind, but often the founder, the large shareholders, the backers still have an idea that an exit will happen, and that's why value will come from these plans. And if that is the case, make your plan exit based. So don't have people, really key people, able to walk away from the business with vast amounts of value when you haven't reached the value event which you were anticipating. Bonus discretionary. So yeah, tends to be a small part of the package. It's, as I touched on in the first slide, it's all about, in those early stages, growing that long-term value in the company. It's not about large amounts of fixed comp upfront. I'd include bonus in that. And the nice thing about helping companies around this type of thing is the pay governance. So compared to getting a company ready for IPO and doing the post-IPO stuff, it's really nice the fact that essentially you've got a lot of freedom to say what is the best fit for this company, and we're not in any way constrained by what the market or shareholder bodies tell us that we can and can't do. Yes, we need to engage our investors, of course we do, but essentially we can come up with what the best fit is here without too much reliance on external interference. So this brings us on to questions for design, and something like this grid is usually my jumping in point when a company comes to us and says that they want a new incentive plan. So I don't use this around salary, but I use this around longer term incentives. Can be as short as the annual bonus, but as I say, the annual bonus doesn't tend to be that important for scale up companies. This is usually more around an equity plan, so making people shareholders, or finding a cash-based way of tying people in the long term. And it's essentially a grid that keeps us honest about the type of design that we want. Because quite often people will jump in with a certain idea of, okay, I heard that these people had growth shares, can we have one of those as well? And we might end up thinking that growth shares are the right answer. But I think it's well worth taking a step back before you go anywhere on your design journey and forget about what you've heard that other people want, and really think about your company and what you want to achieve. And what that looks like is really boiling it down to some key design principles of where you want to drive to. And I usually use this 5-point grid, and we put a cross in the boxes 1 to 5 across the top. That just tells us about some of the extremes of decision making around some key principles. And what we then do is use that to say, okay, what design out there ticks all of these boxes, or as many boxes as we can. And it also allows us to keep checking back at each point in that design journey, because it's always iterative. We always have changes as we go along, but just to make sure that we don't reach a point where what we end up with is the most leveraged tax efficient thing you've ever seen that no one understands, when actually we decided at the beginning the most important thing here is that it's simple, and we weren't that bothered about tax efficiency. You'd be surprised how often that can happen. So just to talk through these, because I think these are the key 8 that I always go through. The first is who, and it goes back to the point I made about getting bang for your buck about make sure your reward spend is doing what you want it to. So if you really think that there's a couple of strategic influencers in your business who are going to drive the value, and that's what you want, keep focused on those couple of people. Don't get sidetracked and think, oh, but it'd be nice to give it to the next 15 people down. What about if management are involved? If the top couple of people are all that is actually going to drive the business outcome that you want, let's focus all of the design around those two people, and vice versa, of course. Next one is whether people are at risk, what often people call skin in the game. So is this something that you want to just be upside for employees and they're not at risk? Or do you actually want your employees to be at risk up front? Do you want them to have to invest a certain amount in shares or pay a certain tax charge up front so that they've actually got money in from day one? Seniority will be really important there. You know, companies tend to think their CEO, CFO, they should back the business enough that they should be comfortable putting a little bit at risk. But if you're putting things down to lower levels, you tend to want less risk to sit on your employees. Next one here, alignment with, is it a wider population or is there a differentiation? Really what we're talking about here is a 2 or a 3-tier plan. So if you do want to run equity and long-term incentives further down the organization, do you want everyone to participate in the same way and have the same goals as the most senior people? And there's not a right and wrong answer in terms of market wide, but I think there will be a right and wrong answer for your particular business. So is it actually the case that people who are participating in this plan, for example, if you're rolling out the CEO's growth targets, is that really likely to be fair to the most junior people in your organization? Can they actually drive that value? And if you put that on, will they believe they can drive that value? Or will this just be something where they don't get it and therefore they don't value it? That ties neatly into the next one down, which is whether goals are individual or collective. I tend to be a fan of some level of differentiation. Once you get down to more junior levels, particularly because of the understandability point, I think it's fair to say that market practice, and it's probably well-advised market practice, is there don't tend to be too many personal goals on. It tends to be stick around for a certain amount of time, don't be on some sort of performance improvement program, and we will give you some value under this plan, rather than having the business having to meet a growth target or you having had to lead your department to some revenue goal. Fifth one, tax. So how important is that tax structure? And as I said before, don't be entirely led by the tax structuring piece of anything, I would say. But do be very mindful that it has some importance, particularly in the UK at the moment with social care levy coming up. We're edging towards marginal rates for employment income towards 50% and CGT of 20%. So there is a big difference between what your employees end up with, and that means a big difference with the level to which they'll be incentivized by a plan. So I would say don't discount it, but really understand at the beginning, bearing in mind the population you're dealing with, how important this will be to those people. Next one down, market practice. Essentially, how important is it? So is this something where you just want to do what everyone else is doing? Or is this something where you really want to differentiate yourselves? You want to be able to say to your employees and say to your future employees in the market, we are doing something completely out of step with what is happening here. And that will inform a lot of the design decision, because if market norms are really important to you, it takes 90% of the types of long-term incentives that people have off the table immediately. And it makes it nice and simple to put in a plan and not to have too much due diligence around how that's achieved, because you'll be on a much simpler path. Doesn't mean it's the right answer. Sometimes it's important to be able to differentiate, but it simplifies the conversation if it's market practice. Next one down is, I suppose, the state of the business. Is this a company that at the moment you are wanting to hold in steady state, or is this all about growth? Because this is a company that is only ever going to go up at a fairly modest rate. Doing something like a share option isn't a market value share option doesn't really incentivize people a great deal because they know they're never going to get much growth out of it. Similarly, high growth, make sure that your goals are focused around growth. So you might be less inclined to put a 5-year retention condition on something like that. Rather, it's about, okay, in the next year, we want to get this business to IPO, for example. So be clear about that. Then we come simplicity. And again, it's often somewhat influenced by the population who are taking part in this and how familiar they will be, the type of plans. But don't assume that just because someone is senior, they will really understand all the nuances, the different types of plans out there. It's well worth, if you're straying away from simplicity, making sure your comms are good. And if you're going to junior levels, simplicity, I would say, should be one of the key goals of your plan. So well worth looking through those 8 points ahead of it and during that design journey, and making sure at the end you've ticked the boxes that you said you intended to. So summary of those types of equity plans, I've mentioned a few words as I went through here, so a bit of a glossary for everyone here. Enterprise Management Incentive, EMI. So this is a plan where it's got a clear tax play to it, and it's about growth. So what an EMI essentially says is, if the company meets the conditions to do this, and I'll touch on those in a moment, any growth in value from the date of grant onwards won't be taxable as income. It won't count as employment income at all. It'll be subject to CGT. So really top popular type of plan for companies that are able to offer this type of thing, because it's kind of got the government sign off that it is a tax efficient plan and everyone's happy with that. There are a lot of restrictions around who can offer it because the tax advantages are so generous. So first of all, you can't grant more than £250,000 worth of shares as measured the date of grant. There are restrictions on the types of company, and that goes back to why the government brought these in the first place, which was essentially to make higher growth companies competitive and able to bring on senior people who would help the business to grow. So it tends to be focused on potentially high growth companies. So they don't want this being offered to property development, where it's just not perceived that they really need that sort of high growth specific knowledge that will take the company to the next level. Can't have gross assets of more than £30 million, can't have more than 250 group employees. But that's still, there are a whole lot of companies who do qualify for this, and that tends to be the go-to if you do qualify for it. Growth shares, it's a way outside of that officially tax-approved legislation to mirror some of those benefits. So instead of, it's not a share option, what you instead do is give someone a share up front, but you say that share will only start to participate in value above a certain hurdle. So if your company is worth £1 million today, you would say to an employee, for example, here's a share, you will participate equally with all other shareholders, but only to the extent that when the company sold, the share is sold, the company is worth in excess of £1 million. And what that does, obviously, compared to a normal ordinary share, is reduce the value of the growth share up front, which means you tend to get fairly small income tax charge on a share up front. There's a valuation exercise to go through, but any uptick will be subject to CGT, and there's no cap on the value that someone can get under that, unlike EMI. Unapproved options and conditional share awards, almost universally now known as RSUs. The Americans have definitely won that one. We don't tend to hear people call them conditional share awards so much anymore. But an RSU, a conditional share award, is essentially something that says, if you stick around for a certain amount of time, we will give you a share for free. That's what that is. Unapproved share option is stick around for a certain amount of time, we will let you buy a share from us at a specific price. That could be as low as nil, it could be at market value, it could be above market value, it could be below. But what all these plans offer is that RSUs and options is great flexibility, because you're not looking for some tax outcome. You're not trying to tick the boxes in the EMI legislation. So you can essentially be entirely flexible with the design terms and participation. The final one there, while we're on the subject of options, is company share option plan, which doesn't have the size restrictions that EMI has on. So more people can offer them, but there is a much lower limit on the amount you can grant under a CSOP. So it's £30,000 instead. The EMI is £250,000. CSOPs, I think they were brought in 1984 with a £30,000 limit. It hasn't moved since. Back then, it was pretty big news. Now they're kind of a nice to have. I mean, if you've got £30,000 of shares and the increase in value, and it's not subject to employment tax, that's nice, but it doesn't really tend to move the dial in the same way as an EMI in terms of retention and recruitment decisions for employees. Final point I wanted to touch on here, risk areas and pitfalls. So yeah, as I've put here, it's not a comprehensive list, but we see these coming up time and again. So is there a route to realizing value if the business objectives fail? So if you were thinking you were going to exit in 6 months and you've geared everything up to that and the exit doesn't happen, can you still realize value through that? Or if you had a very specific type of transaction in mind and that doesn't happen, can you get value? I was dealing with a company recently that had an EMI in for years just because of the way that EMI had been written. Even though the company ended up exiting, the precise mechanics of the exit were just slightly different to how they'd envisaged, and their EMI plan didn't let the plan pay out. So it had a load of employees who just weren't able to meet the exercise conditions, even though in their minds they'd done everything that they were expected to do to grow that business and get it to an exit. So really important to understand how exit will happen, how value will be realized under a plan. Shareholders and equity award holders fully aligned. So as I say, the simplest way to do this is just to give someone a share on day one, but there's lots of reasons to not do that as well, and why you might want to delay giving them value. Make sure those design principles are followed through in such a way that what employees are doing is creating the value that your shareholders want to see. Share pool the right size, particularly when you get investors on board. Several investment rounds can be a particular problem around this. You do see companies end up with just so many different classes of shares, so many different rights. No one really understands what's going on anymore. So really understanding who's got what and why. Valuation issues key for any private company, not just so that employees really understand how much value you are giving them, but also it can be a big risk area for the company, because it often giving employees something carries a tax charge. And if that is a tax charge that should go through payroll, as they so often are, we've seen whole deals fall apart around this. We tax someone on £1 a share. Looking back, perhaps we should have taxed them on £100 a share. Those sorts of examples do happen. And international, as I touched on before, what happens as we start to roll this plan out overseas. And the specific ones for different award types, EMI needs to be full-time or close to full-time. There are so many conditions in EMI legislation about how they should work, around the notifications that should be given, around the limitation on the amount of discretion to flex the terms of a plan post-grant, that pretty regularly now on deals mean it turns out they didn't qualify for EMI at any point, and all these employees who thought they were getting a certain amount of value subject to CGT, actually subject to employment tax, and it's an expensive thing to put that right. CSOP, as I say, pretty flexible in terms of the size of companies, but lots of care needs to be taken around share structures. You can't put them in a subsidiary. When do you want leavers to be able to exercise? That differentiation between good and bad leaver might not match what good and bad leaver provisions are under legislation. And growth shares, conversion rights. So how do you end up actually getting some money out of these on some future exit events if that's what you're minded to do? How do you treat leavers? How do you give people value under these? And I think essentially everything on this slide, it's about doing proper due diligence beforehand and having a well-planned and a well-managed implementation. And I'm not saying everything you do needs to absolute overkill. Every time you invite someone to a plan, you need to sort of reinvent that plan and think it through again. But there's certainly a healthy middle ground between that and what some people do, which is essentially, oh, let's get hold of a set of EMI plan rules that we've used before, or yeah, I think this looks like a CSOP, or yeah, growth shares. Okay, we think the company's worth about this. Let's offer it on that. Those are the types of things that do come back to bite companies, and where taking the easy route up front usually leads to a lot of pain when it comes to actually trying to exit those plans, trying to exit the company, trying to get employees value through the plans. So just really understanding why you're doing what you're doing, that it is creating value, that the plan itself works, and that it ends up with value in the hands of an employee that employee understands. I think as long as you keep those in mind, you're in a good place. Okay, so we are 45 minutes through. Any questions for anyone? We've got 15 minutes at the end. If we open the lines, if anyone wants to pick anything up there.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the presentation. That was really interesting, and just joining those dots on the sort of different stages of the company's growth and how the reward scheme is evolved alongside that is really, really interesting. So we do have a question that's just come through from Catherine. So you mentioned the elements of total reward. How do you assess what each business needs in terms of each of these elements? Does it depend on whether attraction or retention is most important? Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's really about, a lot of it is about listening to the market. So your employees tend to tell you if they're unhappy with part of reward. If you go into the market and try to recruit people, it becomes clear pretty quickly what is important to those, to people around those things, and what other companies are doing. And I think that kind of listening exercise is of particular importance when it comes to the intangibles, because it's something where we see lots of differentiation. You know, so many companies at the moment, and so much of the media at the moment is talking about, oh, people just want complete flexibility and all these types of things. And yeah, I work with on reward packages with clients where that is the thing. You know, I'm working with a media company at the moment where all of their employees would very happily, an office didn't exist. But then you have other companies which are more, let's say, knowledge based and rely on a degree of interaction. It can be professional services like I do, can be, you know, certainly a couple of life sciences companies I'm dealing with at the moment, where actually time on site isn't an old-fashioned concept. Employees want that. They get that that's how they learn. They find it really important for their personal well-being. So really listening to your employees and would-be employees around those intangibles, I think is very important. When it comes to the set parts of remuneration, I think being guided by, going back to the earlier points here around, be cognizant of where you are as a business and therefore what it is practice to offer there. So if you are very much in startup mode, you like not have loads of cash, don't go trying to find loads of cash and giving someone a big fixed package. It should be around hope value. You want senior people who are bought into the long-term huge potential of this company and ability to do that. And alongside that, you wouldn't want, you know, your annual bonus to be a big thing. You want it to be about something quite long-term. And when it comes to LTIs, then going through to these thoughts here, so long-term incentives, what is it exactly that you want that person to do? Which people are these plans being offered to? So yes, I think it's one of those things where you don't want to be sort of stereotypical consultant here and say, oh, there's no right answer. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no right or wrong answer if you look at the totality of UK business. There will be a right and wrong answer for your business, though, and that should take into account the sector that you're in and where you are as a business in terms of the phase of that business. What are you trying to do? What size are you?
Thank you, Richard. One question that came to my mind. So at One Nucleus, we do or have a lot of discussions around building great careers in the life science sector. What are the challenges that industry sees from their perspective, and then maybe career seekers see from their perspective? So do you feel that non-cash rewards or incentives are increasingly providing more value to maybe the younger generation of the workforce that's coming up? Do you think they're looking for more outside of sort of cash rewards?
So they certainly are, but the way in which it's delivered is key. So we are seeing equity deep into organizations than we did before, but we're also seeing much shorter term equity than we have done in the past. 3 to 5 years used to be typical for how do we get value out of this business. Whereas if you say to the kind of average new joiner, 25 or under, you have to wait 3 to 5 years to get this, they're simply not going to be incentivized by it. So much as it would be nice to say, well, we kind of think people should be with the business for the long term, really sort of understanding, well, actually, can we get value out of this person if they do hang around for a year, 2 years, something under the sort of 3 to 5 year norm, and being willing to flex your plan, say, okay, you might not get full value for 5 years, but we're going to start paying out some value under this pretty soon. Or really communicating clearly, we've got this exit event in mind, and this is how that's going to come through. In terms of some of the intangibles, it's certainly true that people, depending on their stage in life, value different intangibles. But I think there's been a tendency to oversimplify around these sorts of things. Certainly when the immediate post-COVID bit, I think there was a lot of thought leadership that suggested, well, young people don't want to come to the office anyway, and they want to be flexible and just pick up their laptop in wherever they want to work. And actually loads of companies have found the exact opposite. And actually it's the younger members of staff who value coming into the office for that social interaction. It's probably people more like my age who would rather have the flexibility to stay at home rather more and do childcare and all of those sorts of considerations. So not kind of jumping to the conclusion around what those good intangibles are, but just being cognizant that the young workforce that we've got coming through at the moment are expecting to be incentivized in a different way to people who are a little older.
Thank you. Yeah, it really is about getting a balance that is kind of gonna, will suit, the looking at a team as a whole. I mean, the One Nucleus is a small team, and I have worked for bigger companies in the past, but being part of a small team where everyone is, hands on deck, I can't imagine anymore being in a company where only certain people get incentivized or rewarded at a certain level. I mean, it just seems natural that you can only achieve the company's aims and goals when everyone is considered. Veronica, thank you for your question. So Veronica's asking, what type of rewarding strategy would you advise for an early stage / startup company, particularly if you don't have a lot of cash available?
Yeah, so I'd say be mindful of this graph here, and that not having much cash available isn't an unusual challenge to face in the early stages. So if you've got prospective employees who are thinking about joining a very early stage company, and that is the kind of point of the business life cycle of which excites them and they want to get involved in, they're probably not getting a load of offers of really high salaries from other places. You'll be up against other people who are selling them on the long-term dream of the business. So it's about finding that hope value, getting someone to be a shareholder or have the potential to be a shareholder is a really nice way of doing that. So the EMI options that I talked through, we've got ordinary shares, which essentially just give someone some shares now. RSUs I talked about earlier, where it's okay, we're not going to give you shares today, but as long as you stick around for a certain amount of time and do a couple of other forms, conditions, we'll give you some free shares for later. You want to essentially be able to tell your people, yes, we're completely cognizant of the fact you could go to a FTSE 100 and get a higher salary, no doubt. But this is an exciting place to work. We're doing exciting work. We're on an exciting growth journey, and you are genuinely participating in that, and not through some annual bonus that if the company grows exponentially, you might get another £5,000 or something. You're going to be a shareholder in this business. That means, you know, it's the amount that you get from this is uncapped. You know, I work with companies that were certainly in the tech space that were startups relatively recently and are now listed companies. Yeah, where people in their 20s have made retirement money out of these types of things. And just being able to say to people, what you're getting here is genuinely transformative stuff that a really large company simply can't offer you because their businesses aren't growing quickly enough. I think that is the way to reward people. And if people don't buy into that, you probably don't really want them. You know, it's challenging having a startup and an early stage scale up. You want people who aren't going to jump ship the first time that someone offers them a 5% pay rise or something like that. You need people who are bought in for the longer term and believe in the business.
Thank you, Richard. And of course, the excitement and innovation is one of the best aspects of working in the sector. So I think that probably drives a lot of people, and also the impact that you're having on potential therapies and treatments, life-saving treatments. Just another question, given we're, off the back of a extremely challenging time for all businesses and organizations of all sizes across the globe, what would you recommend if motivation is slipping within the team, or if technology changes are making a certain role or goal more difficult? Any tips?
It is a challenging one. So to me, it's part of this cycle around reward. So really understanding what you're rewarding people for and why, that they understand it and that they value it. So if motivation is slipping, why is that? Is that one of your tangibles? Is it that people don't understand their short-term incentives, their long-term incentives? Is it that the tangibles are in a good place, but the intangibles aren't? And actually, you need to focus on some of these other areas and say, okay, I think we're competitive when it comes to pay, but what are we doing around recognition? What are we doing around where people work and how? Are people bogged down by the amount of admin that they need to do? And really take your employees on that journey with them. Yeah, I think far too many companies are always thinking about this stuff behind the scenes, but not making employees part of the conversation. I mean, firstly, their feedback is absolutely invaluable. But secondly, they value the fact that if they're not happy with where you are at the moment, you're going to be somewhere pretty different fairly soon. And that flexible working one is a classic, isn't it? Of if we do have too rigid working patterns, and that is making people unhappy, and they are starting to look at businesses where they don't have to drive to Cambridge every day, to use an example that might be relevant. Really making employees understand, we're listening to you, we're looking at it, we're moving to this hybrid model. This is the sort of time scale. This is what it's going to look like. This is the autonomy that you're going to have. And just try to really make people buy into where you're going to end up if they're not happy with where you are at the moment.
So really around that kind of communication element, then making people feel included and inclusive environment, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly. But while keeping in mind that number one driver that I touched on right at the beginning is, what is the business trying to achieve here, and everything tying into that. And if hybrid working will never be the right answer for your business, your people are never going to be happy, and you're just going to have to go through some pain where some people exit, and you'll have to recruit people who are more tied into what you're trying to do as a business. So don't be entirely steered by what people want to do, yeah, but to the extent that you can achieve your business goals while flexing to what people want to do, that's what you should be looking at.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. I think we are pretty much up to time now. I can't see any further questions in the chat, and I'm just looking to see if anybody's got their hand up, and I can't see anything there. If there are any questions post session, sorry for any background noise, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to link you to EY, and you can continue the discussion. With that, I'd just like to say thank you, Richard, for your time to present to the audience this morning. That was really interesting and really useful. Thank you all to the attendees who have managed to join us. I hope you found the session just as useful and interesting as I did, and are leaving with some key insights to hopefully utilize and put into practice in future. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.